Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this Cardiff University event. We have a wide variety of people joining us today from across the UK and around the globe, Barry, Brisbane and Bridgend, to name a few. This is the latest in our event series called For Alumni by Alumni Live, where we hand over the webcams and mics to our fabulous alumni to share their thoughts, expertise, passions and experiences on topics which will inspire, engage and spark curiosity within our community. This event is being recorded and we will send you the link in our follow-up email. So my name is Hannah Sterrett. I am the Alumni and Supporter Engagement Officer at Cardiff University and fellow alumna, and it is my privilege to introduce you to today's speakers. So Bleddyn Harris is extremely passionate about amplifying the voices and stories of the LGBTQ communities to inspire a more equitable society. His advocacy and activism work, which includes going into schools and delivering sessions on LGBTQ+ inclusion, curriculum and history, has led to interviews on ITV Wales and BBC Radio Wales, as well as delivering seminars and lectures on LGBTQ+ workplace inclusion for organisations like Stonewall Cymru and the National Trust. He is currently recognised on the Pink List as one of the top 15 LGBTQ+ community role models in Wales and is the chair of the Senate's award-winning LGBTQ+ staff network. During the initial COVID-19 lockdown, Bleddyn founded LGBTQ the not-for-profit organisation that put on the first ever Wales-wide virtual Pride and will soon be releasing the first ever Wales-wide LGBTQ+ magazine. And Crash Wigley is currently studying the Bar Training Course, LLM, at Cardiff University School of Law and Politics and will begin training as a pupil barrister at Civitas in September 2021. In their spare time, Crash directs the Cardiff Trans Singers and volunteers for Liberty's Human Rights Advice and Information Service. Crash is a recipient of Gray's Inn's Baroness Hale of Richmond Scholarship and has been featured on Wales Online's Pink List for their contributions to LGBTQ equality. So welcome, Bleddyn and Crash, and thank you so much for your time this evening. As we get into our topic of discussion for this evening, can we educate out LGBT+ prejudice? I just wanted to set the scene because February is LGBT+ History Month. So for context, if our audience aren't familiar with its history, LGBT+ History Month was started by the education charity Schools Out in 2005 in response to the repealing of the lengthy period between 1988 and 2003, when Section 28 legislation, which at its simplest prevented teachers from talking about same-sex relationships in schools, and which is now widely regarded to scar a whole generation of LGBT+ people. LGBT+ History Month exists to bring queer history to light after many years of school children hearing nothing positive about LGBT+ people and LGBT+ culture. We've of course made progress since then. Just last year, we saw a historic moment where LGBT inclusive relationships and sex education was introduced in England schools and in Scotland and Wales as well in the next few years. That is why we chose the topic of discussion for tonight, and I hope all attendees will have some food for thought by the end of the discussion. So to kick off this evening, can you give us an overview of your career to date and the career paths you've chosen? Bleddyn, would you mind starting? Thank you. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah,
There we go.
That was the best thing I had said as well. That's probably the best thing I've said all day. So hi, yes, my name is Bleddyn Harris. My pronouns are he, they. I'm 28 and I'm from Merthyr Tydfil, which means you are all now acutely aware of the last place you saw your purse and wallets, but don't worry, I'm not actually in your homes. It's fine. So my career pathway. So my first job was in Nando's. If we will start at the very beginning, it's a very good place to start. And whilst then studying at university, I was working at Nando's, but then I became a makeup artist as well for Calvin Klein and then Illamasqua. That took me across the world and I became an international makeup artist before coming back to the UK and becoming an English language and literature teacher in secondary school. Following on from that, I currently work in Senedd Cymru, the Welsh Parliament, as an organisational development and learning manager and chair of the Board of Trustees and editor for LGBTQ Cymru. So quite varied, actually. You know, I think I've always said that I've let my passions direct where I go next, because I think that's really important, that you do what you're passionate about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bleddyn. And yourself, Crash?
Yeah, I guess also kind of a varied journey in a way. When I was in school and when I started off at university, I really wanted to be a lecturer. But after finishing my degree, I kind of realised that academia perhaps was not what was calling me. So I started off working as a campaigner, and I worked as the policy and campaigns officer at Stonewall Cymru, working on LGBT equality here in Wales. And then in the last couple of years, I'm currently in the middle of a career switch into law, as you mentioned when you were introducing me. So I'm actually as much a current student of Cardiff University, really, rather than an alum. But I'm currently, having done my law conversion, on the bar training course, and I will be starting to train as a pupil barrister here in Cardiff from September.
And I'm both your experiences, I'm sure you'll bring a lot to the conversation this evening, so thank you. Just going straight into it, actually, what, Bleddyn, is your experience of being a teacher and the education system in Wales? Very big question, I know.
That is a very big question indeed. So my experience with the education sector in Wales is that I loved being a teacher. I really did love being a teacher. I often talk about being a teacher the way that people talk about gin, you know, like I love gin, but it doesn't love me. And I felt that it was the same sentiment in being a teacher, in that I absolutely loved teaching. I loved teaching. And I probably wouldn't have left if it was different. There were extremely long nights. I had no social life, really. I couldn't make time for it. You know, the 6 weeks off wasn't 6 weeks off. And I decided that for my own well-being that I had to make a career change. And it came at the right time, in fact, that the job within the Senedd was advertised. I think there's a lot more that can be done. I think there's a lot more that is actually being done. But I would say, you know, teachers who are still in the education, who are still teaching, I tip my hat to. I take my hat off, actually, because I met so many passionate people. And it's literally all about the children. It's all about the young adults, the students. I've never known a teacher not have that feeling when it comes to teaching. So I think there's a lot that could be improved. Kind of what we're talking about here tonight as well in regards to LGBTQ+ inclusion within the education system, within the curriculum. But broadly speaking, my experiences of being a teacher were wonderful. As a gay teacher, maybe not so much, if I look at it through that lens. There were a number of things that also contributed to me leaving the profession. One of which actually became quite a big story, in that when I was working in one school, and I must stress, and I regret not stressing this more at the time, actually, that it wasn't a result of what the school was saying, but it was a result of a course that I was sent on by the school, which was part of the kind of core training. So I was teaching in a Catholic school, which was phenomenal. The teachers there were amazing and extremely supportive, and they loved the pupils. You know, it was an exemplar school. But I went on this course on how to be the best Catholic school teacher, and I was told by a member, someone who represented the church, that in order, you know, one of the things you have to teach pupils is that it's a sin to be gay. And I was sat across the table from this individual, and I was like, no, I am gay. That's not going to happen. And there was a debate about it, and I knew, like, I was never going to relay that information to a pupil. It was never going to come from my mouth, and I was always going to challenge it if I ever did hear it. But, you know, again, I just want to stress that I went back to the school the next day, and I couldn't have been welcomed with, I couldn't have had more support upon turning up that day. So the school was actually really great. It was just some of the messages coming from left of centre.
Absolutely. Wow. And how about yourself, Crash? What is your experience of the education system in Wales? And potentially, could you touch on your experience when you worked with Stonewall Cymru and the sort of campaigns that you were involved with?
Yeah, oh, definitely a little bit. I mean, I went to school in Wales, went to school in Cardiff. I also went to a church school, but not a Catholic school. And I would say when I was in school, I had the kind of experience that I think a lot of LGBT young people had. So I had some incidents of bullying and harassment, and I wasn't out as trans when I was in school, but I was at various points out as gay or as bi, and I was also like visibly kind of gender non-conforming when I was in school, and you know, that was a negative experience that kind of carried around me. But I think what a lot of people experienced at school was just that LGBT issues kind of weren't talked about, and there was a silence around the topic on the part of the school. And like I have one memory of, at one point, either some students or maybe a teacher had wanted to set up an LGBT club in my school, like to meet at lunch times for students, and the posters had been put up first thing in the morning. So I'd seen them when I'd walked into school. By break time, I'd gone back to see what the details were for this club, and all the posters had been taken down. And clearly, someone somewhere higher up had decided that this person, whoever, had decided to set this up without the right permission, and had taken all these down. Now, I never found out what the story behind this club was, like who'd wanted to set it up, what would the story behind the posters being taken down. But you can imagine the kind of impact that has on a young person who quite clearly gets the message, like, this is not a topic that's appropriate to discuss or to have a club around at school. And you know, you mentioned Section 28. Now, Section 28 had long gone by the time that I was starting high school. I started high school in 2005. You know, there was a couple of years at least after the legislation had gone, but that the chilling impact it had in telling teachers it's not appropriate to talk about these issues to young people, to students, still carried on. And so it was just not really a part of teaching. There was, you maybe heard about it in RE lessons. My school never went so far as saying it was a sin, but what they would do is say, this religion thinks it's sinful, this denomination thinks it's sinful, this denomination thinks it's sinful, and in this denomination there are mixed views. And I mean, even in the context of RE, I think that's a really flat way to talk about the fact that in every religion, in every denomination, and probably in every church, there are going to be LGBT people there for whom their faith is a really important part of who they are. And I think that positive side of LGBT people's spiritual experiences is completely glossed over in the way that schools even talk about the issue in RE. But then thinking more broadly across the curriculum where LGBT issues talked about, they weren't. And this connects with some of the work we did when I was at Stonewall. I got to work on a report that we produced based on a survey of LGBT young people. And that survey was relatively recent. I think the survey got carried out in 2016, 2017. And yet still, so many young people in Wales were saying, my school does not talk about LGBT issues. And some of the quotes were like, I've never heard anything positive said about LGBT issues in my school. People get asked about, you know, their experiences in PSE. When you're learning about relationships, when you're learning about sex education, are LGBT issues discussed? People would just say no. And some very shocking statistics still about the prevalence of bullying. And what I'd say to people listening is that although you might have a sense that these days that, you know, society has become a lot more accepting of LGBT people and of equality more generally, the picture in schools has not changed anywhere near as much as people assume it has. And I think that is the big challenge going forward, is we acknowledge that, you know, even young people themselves are much more informed about LGBT issues and the representation in the media and stuff. All that trickles down. There's no doubt that young people's understanding of these issues has moved ahead, but how schools deal with them and whether they talk about LGBT issues in a positive and affirming way, whether they support students, whether they're committed to eradicating bullying, I think there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done in those areas.
It's really concerning, isn't it? Because actually when you go to school, that's such a formative time of your life. And if you're hearing negative things about you just wanting to be yourself, it hurts, of course. And I imagine, as we kind of touched on already, really has an impact, a lasting impact on a young person's life. We did touch on kind of the media just now. So I'd love to kind of get your insights into what the impact of hit TV shows and films have had on the furthering of LGBT plus education. Bleddyn, should I go to you first?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you. That's a really good question. I remember growing up that there was, along with what Crash was saying there, like a kind of silence in school. I didn't really see anyone like me in books, on TV. I didn't see anyone like me anywhere. And if I did, it would be, attributed to some devastating story. Which made me think that my life actually was just doomed before it really quite begun. I think as time has gone on, media representation has, there's an increase in LGBTQ plus people on TV. There's an increase of there is an increase of LGBTQ plus people on TV, but when it comes to how that's presented then, I think outside of TV presenters, people like Ryan Clark, Ellen DeGeneres, who have their own shows, when you think of things that have been written by other people, there are queer roles in TV and there are queer roles in movies and in books, but they're usually portrayed by someone who isn't queer. It's usually portrayed by someone who's cisgendered and usually someone who's straight, who then perform being gay or being a gay woman or being bi or being trans. And that's quite damaging then, because what that does, or what that subconsciously does, it makes you think that it demonstrates that LGBTQ plus people are still not given the access in the media to be themselves. And more often than not, these roles are being written through the lens of a heterosexual through a heterosexual cisgendered lens to be made more palatable for the wider audience. It's difficult in that, if we take, a point of contention lately was James Corden in The Prom. I think I got about 5 minutes into the movie and I was like, no, because it absolutely wasn't for me, because I found it really rather offensive, if I'm entirely honest. Contextually, if we think about James Corden, only the year before had he been absolutely unapologetic in his inclusion of a slur in Gavin and Stacey, the Christmas edition. Entirely unapologetic. In fact, defended it, instead of recognizing that, many queer individuals would have sat at home during Christmas with their family at that time and would have known that word would have been coming up. And then as soon as it was said, everyone in that room would have turned to or there would have been this kind of like, you could have heard a pin drop, the atmosphere that would have come from that. So instead of apologizing and recognizing that, absolutely defended it. The following year then, they're playing this ostentatious, flamboyantly camp person, that role within The Prom. Do you mean to tell me that there are no middle-aged, ostentatious, camp, gay actors in Hollywood? Because I can think of 5 now. And what this does is it makes it seem like it almost perpetuates this idea that who we are, our personalities, are performances. If James Corden, a straight cisgendered person, can be doing it, then obviously Bleddyn is putting it on. Because
oh, sorry.
Well,
no, I didn't mean to interrupt. But I think the point you make about authenticity is really important, because in the history, it's not just that LGBT characters weren't on TV screens looking back. Often they were, and often even if people couldn't be open about their sexual orientation in terms of how they wrote TV characters, there would be really obvious codes and clues to make it clear to the audience, oh, this stereotype means this actor is a gay man, and then the role would be played to kind of generate laughs. So it's often there, it's just that the kind of way the parts are written, they're not authentic, and often they are written in a way that is either played for laughs, or sometimes you get like parts that are written that are played to kind of educate people. So you get the kind of after school special, and it would be a sort of usually a gay or maybe a bi character who comes in for an episode as like the school exchange student, causes some ruckus due to their sexual orientation, teaches everybody an important lesson about inclusion, and then is either killed off or leaves having served their purpose. So seeing characters that you can kind of really get a sense of their own humanity, I think that's often what's been lacking, and that hasn't changed until you get not just actors and characters cast better, but also the writing rooms becoming more diverse. And one of the things that I would encourage people who are interested in the history of representation to take a look at is the documentary Disclosure, which is currently on Netflix, which is really, really amazing. Like it's quite heartwarming at times. It can be quite emotional. It can be really funny. But it's a documentary looking at the history of trans people's representation in film and TV. And what's amazing about Disclosure is that not only are they building this documentary based on interviews with trans people who've had careers in the industry, so you're kind of getting a lot of this from the horse's mouth, but also the production team, the writing team is clearly dominated by trans people who are telling the stories from a trans person's perspective, and not just what does someone who isn't trans think about trans people and think about how a trans story should be told. So it's really eye-opening, and one of the things that I love about it is that it's going through all these films that are really familiar to people. Where so it spends some time looking at like the sort of trans woman serial killer trope that's in Silence of the Lambs and Psycho, and the kind of damage that sort of representation of a sort of psychopathic cross-dresser has been in introducing the idea of what trans women in particular are like to the public at large. So I think a lot of people will kind of realize stuff that hadn't particularly sunk in from films that they know well and they love from history. Well, here's actually trans people talking about some of the issues that kind of representation has caused.
Absolutely, thank you. I encourage anybody who is watching to watch that documentary. It's absolutely fascinating, and I learned so much from it, so thank you. One of the questions we've had from the audience is from Maya in Lampeter, and they've said, how can we eradicate anti-LGBT plus prejudice from the most rural and isolated areas of Wales? Crash, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think one of the things is connected to the media point, because I think it's really important that we have sort of positive, authentic representations of LGBT people reflected in our media. But one of the other stereotypes and narratives that's been really dominant in representations of sort of queer life and queer happiness on TV is this idea that you have to move to a big city, and often I think in Wales that gets translated as at least moving to Cardiff and probably moving to England or to another country, in order to escape this backward prejudice from the place that you grew up, and to finally be able to be yourself. And I think of it as kind of like a sort of Will and Grace stereotype, because that show was so fundamental in kind of defining the parameters of how gay life was represented on TV in its own kind of flawed way. And in fairness, I think it's sometimes a trope that's even perpetuated by LGBT people, because it can chime in with our own experiences of having grown up and having faced abuse and discrimination, of having had to move away from it. But there's a real issue when that becomes the dominant picture, because for young people growing up in rural places, it's this constant message that is, you won't be happy unless you leave your community, and that pressure to leave, rather than acknowledge that actually people should be able to feel at home wherever they live, and in every community. So I think thinking about how we challenge the media angle from that, I think it's really important to reflect kind of rural LGBT life, especially for young people, but for people of all ages, and in Wales, in English language media and in Welsh language media, to ensure that LGBT stories are being told, and that we're not continuing to render LGBT people outside of the big cities invisible. Now, I don't think media is the only solution. Yeah, perhaps I'll leave it to someone else to focus up on some of the other points, but I think, you know, education also clearly plays a big role in making sure, and essentially is an opportunity to challenge homophobia and biphobia and transphobia in every community in Wales.
Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing I could say that could really enrich anything that Crash has said there regarding media representation, and this idea that if you're going to be queer, you need to go to this, you know, this metropolis that you go to. But in regards to education, I think that's definitely the first step, you know. When we think of the teaching education, or we think of the teaching profession, it's largely made up of white, straight, cisgendered individuals. You know, our teaching profession is lacking wildly in diversity. You know, very often I was referred to as the gay one because I was. And I think, you know, there was research out, it was about, what are we now, 2020, so it was 2 years ago, that there was research that denoted 1 in 10 incidents of serious homophobic, you know, queerphobic incidents were at the hands of the teachers as well. The teachers were involved. And I think we need to remember that, you know, teachers are people as well, and they have their own biases, they have their own prejudices. But I think a real opportunity for us is to start in an education centre, teaching teachers on how to teach about LGBTQ plus topics, because we mentioned Section 28 earlier. There will still be people who were teaching during Section 28 that are still teaching now, and still have that fear that, you know, I can't talk about this because there are people after, you know, you were talking about the, you know, Crash was talking about the chilling impact and how that's lasted. It still lasts now. I see, you know, I was there, I saw it, I experienced it. Teachers were just wildly underprepared and didn't know how to talk about LGBTQ plus issues. In fact, they actively avoided it because they didn't feel they knew what they were talking about. So we need to educate our teachers. There needs to be opportunities to educate our teachers on how to educate young people. Because as Crash mentioned, we're connected to the world now via social media and via the, you know, any kind of website. So we can learn anything about anyone, anywhere, which provides amazing opportunities for us. But then it's almost jarring. It's almost a paradox when you go into a school that was built in the 80s and you feel like you're actually still in the 80s because of the absolute silence.
I think the one of the things that was quite depressing in the research we did at Stonewall Cymru when I was there was this idea that also so many young people said they had experiences of teachers witnessing bullying or homophobic language or transphobic language and not doing anything about it, basically, and turning a blind eye. And I don't think that was because that was coming necessarily from a place of hostility for those teachers, but I think it reflects this idea that for a lot of professionals, if you haven't had any training, and we know that most teachers haven't had any training about talking about LGBT issues, how to intervene in that kind of situation in a positive way. People worry about putting a foot wrong, like drawing more attention to it. Perhaps some people underplay how serious what they're seeing is. But when people are unsure of what to do, their default is not to act. You know, that's true in any area of life. And so I completely agree with you, Bleddyn. What's so important is that there is practical training for teachers in how to create inclusive and supportive spaces for all learners. And I think there are lots of opportunities that are pointing schools in that direction now. One of them, of course, is the new curriculum, and the fact that in the new curriculum in Wales, sex education has been redesigned, reimagined as relationships and sexuality education, and it will be a statutory requirement for all schools to teach that in an inclusive way for students of all ages. So there's no running away from the LGBT question now. But also, I think another thing that's making a big difference in schools is that more and more students are feeling like they can be confident in coming out as trans when they're at school. And I knew I was trans when I was at school, but I wouldn't have dreamt of coming out as trans when I was at school because I didn't know anyone who had done it. And so I felt like I had to wait till I went to university, where I'd have a bit more freedom and I wouldn't, have to worry so much about a really potentially unsupportive and quite threatening reaction if things didn't go well if I came out at school. But the thing about trans young people is that if you've got students coming out as trans, that's just not an issue that teachers can ignore in the same way that I think that they felt able to ignore students who are gay and bi and the issues that they're facing. Because if you've got a student who's trans and who's transitioned and is going by a new name or has changed the pronouns that they use, that is something that at some point you are going to have to address as a teacher, and you need to do it in a proficient and confident and affirming way. And I think that has, again, woken up a lot of schools to the needs. Now, if you look at the statistics for the experiences of trans young people in Welsh schools, they are substantially worse, even more so than that of cisgender LGBT students. And there is clearly a lot of work to be done. Some schools are doing a good job, but I think that the majority of schools, even with the best of intentions, are struggling to make sure that trans learners are safe and fully accepted in schools. But it does, again, create this opportunity that with the right training, with the right resources, that schools can become much more safe and inclusive spaces.
Yeah, and on that as well, you talk about the RSE and how that's been introduced into the curriculum as well. I think there are a lot of schools that do well. But what I do fear is that with the relationship and sex education now is that people will almost think that, right, this term we're going to do the LGBTQ+, it's going to be the LGBTQ+ term. But in fact, it doesn't really need to be that. It doesn't need to be like one big rainbow day and then we're done for the year. It needs to be something that is drip fed throughout, something that is consistent, because, there are consistent, you will most likely meet LGBTQ+ people consistently throughout your life. So it shouldn't be any different in the curriculum. An example that I can give you is an example of usualization, and it happened back in the 2003 WJEC exams, where they started introducing more names, more varying names. So instead of saying something like Sue and Ben went to the shop and spent £10, they had £20, how much money have they got left? Sue and her girlfriend went to the shop. Those were the kinds of things I did at the beginning of lessons, and those are the kind of things that teachers adopted as well across the rest of their lessons. Like a 5-minute grammar starter, correct the spelling, punctuation, and grammar in this sentence. And yeah, of course, the kids kind of go like, oh, Sue and her girlfriend. Oh, Sue's gay. Oh yeah, but Sue's gay. Oh, yeah. And then they crack on. It's always a bit of a shock at the first time, but it's this introducing it and not making a big show and dance about it, because that's when I think you almost welcome in this onslaught of what can become a debate, because, you know, as a teacher, you also have to consider the fact that you have parents you're accountable to, or it's made to feel that you're accountable to. You know, you've got those different pressures. Then you have the pressures to make sure that the well-being of the pupil is looked after. You have the sometimes conflicting messages that you're getting from the parents then, and then right in the middle you have the school that has never tackled LGBTQ plus issues before.
Yeah,
it's an example of how not enough has been done, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think these resources and I think this training need to be made readily available and free as well, if I'm entirely honest. I don't think we should, you know, this is for the well-being of LGBTQ plus pupils, and for that of straight pupils and cisgendered pupils as well, actually, because I think the more that we can usualize everyone, and the more we can teach pupils about everyone in the world, the better equipped they are to go and be in the world once they leave. You know, trust and believe. I thought I knew everything at 18. You know, I thought there was nothing that I didn't know. But having been a teacher and then teaching pupils at 18, I realized just how young I was compared to how and just how really we didn't equip people to go into the wider world. Absolutely.
Well, one thing that would be really interesting to get both your perspectives on is how individuals can be an effective LGBT plus ally, and kind of how individuals in their current life can make sure that they're championing the LGBT community at every level. Crash, would you mind going first for that?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing is, I think sometimes when people think about that question, it can become like a bit overwhelming. But I think the main thing is just, you know, identify opportunities in your community, whether that's in your workplace or outside the workplace, whether that's even in your family, where you can do things that will make a practical, positive impact on LGBT people, and that in particular that you do that in a way that shares power with LGBT people, because I think sometimes where people go wrong is they sort of effectively appoint themselves as ally, and then they decide kind of what the solutions people need are, and obviously deciding how to solve someone else's problem from your perspective often means that you can make mistakes and solve things in a way that isn't actually productive. But I think as long as you're working with LGBT people, you're sharing your power, you're working to empower the people who are essentially disempowered and cut out of a lot of decision-making structures, then just focus on, you know, what things you can do that are going to practically make a difference to people.
Fab, thank you. And Bleddyn?
Definitely. Again, there's nothing I could really say that would enrich what Crash has already said there. I just think that when we talk about allyship as well, people often think that it means that you have to put on this cape and become like a super person. And every time you see something, you know, discriminatory or prejudice, that you have to be straight in there and you have to be like, you know, ready to go. And while that is great, I won't lie. It's always nice to have other people support you in these kind of like ongoing situations you can find yourself in. It isn't necessarily always that. As Crash said, it's about being open, it's about listening. One of the things I would definitely stress is that to be an ally, don't put yourself at the center of what is going on. Recently, an example, there's an individual on LinkedIn who is, you know, identifies as male and wouldn't wear, or hasn't worn female clothing, but then decided to put a skirt on and write a post about how difficult it must be for people who wear skirts. And I was like, it was almost tone deaf, really, and that, well, that's not your experience. So, you know, don't bolster your own platform. You know, raise and the voices and the stories and the experiences of the people around you, the people that you're aiming to help, because it's their stories, it's their experiences, it's their faces that will educate you and educate everyone else. Just don't put yourself at the center of it.
I think that's really powerful. It's such a simple thing, but actually means so much. So no, that's really useful, and thank you. We've only got time for one more question. I can't quite believe how quickly this evening has gone, but I thought it might be a good one to close on, which is kind of what's next? In your opinion, what is the next important issue to prioritise in order to educate out LGBT plus prejudice? Bleddyn, go ahead.
What's the next thing? Oh, that's, as in what, like what's our next step? What do we do immediately from today?
What should we prioritise?
Educating out, I think. So I think from my perspective, it would be to make sure that we equip teachers in talking about LGBTQ plus issues within a school environment, to help support and eradicate LGBTQ plus discrimination from the get-go. Because I think there's a wealth of opportunities, not enough, but I think there's a wealth of opportunities for older generations, people who are maybe not in school, to educate themselves, to be educated by other people. You know, there are organisations across all of the UK, people like Stonewall as well, that are fantastic diversity and inclusion strands within their organisation that can help that. People like Stonewall Cymru, people like Stonewall as well, are external organisations that come in and provide that support. But I think a means to an end would be to support teachers in their development and understanding of LGBTQ plus issues and how to tackle them, so that it's a cultural change. Pupils growing up and going through the education system now will always know that you can't bully someone for being LGBTQ plus, because that's been reinforced for nearly 13 years of their life, the formative years of their life.
Yeah. So
that's where I think we go next. But I also think that we need to pay, particular attention to the fact, the intersectional elements of this as well, in that there are, as Crash has mentioned there, trans individuals in schools, their experience of discrimination in schools is exponentially greater than those of their LGBT siblings. Individuals, Black individuals who are also gay or bi or trans, we need to make sure that we're not looking at this as a whole and then missing out the individual. We need to make sure that we're paying attention to every single part of this.
Thank you. And Crash?
I think in terms of what comes next, there's two sides of this, and one of it is how do we educate young people, but also I think we have to recognise that actually, if you look at polls on how accepting people are of LGBT people, it's adults who have a problem by and large. And so while the changes to the curriculum, ensuring that teachers have proper training to make sure that they can realise that and ensure that their teaching is inclusive, like across the whole curriculum and across the school environment. But I think for adults, adults mainly learn through media, whether that's film, TV, the press. And I think there is a real challenge in Wales about how we make sure that LGBT people are represented in the media, and that comes from diversifying media workforces, because I think it's just one of those fundamental principles in how you represent people is there should be nothing about us without us, and I think that applies for LGBT people. So when I think one of the issues at the moment is that there is a barrage of media hostility directed at trans people, particularly in London-centric UK press, which is what Wales relies upon overwhelmingly for its news sources. And that's a perfect example of these newsrooms, these editorial rooms, writing a lot about trans issues, but not really ever employing or engaging trans people to write about trans issues. Now, there's a huge conversation to be had about the media in Wales and how we develop a proper and robust media scene in Wales. But my challenge is that in doing that, how do we make sure that the diversity of our communities is represented in that workforce, so that the stories that get communicated, whether that's press or film or TV, are done so in an authentic way, and that allows that diversity to speak for itself rather than be spoken for.
Can I just ask then, though? I'd like to follow up on that then. I mentioned earlier, because I think that's a sterling point, and I think it's absolutely right. How then do we make sure that there are the opportunities for that? Because, you could go as far to suggest as media, that we still live within an institutionally queerphobic society, and that everything, I mentioned earlier, things are pushed through and are thought through a heteronormative, cisgendered lens. People will want to put out stuff that sells. And more often than not, or you could suggest more often than not, LGBTQ plus people are not put at the forefront. There are not many stories about us because largely, it's not profitable, which I guess is can be countered with, obviously, with the success of It's a Sin being on like Channel 4's most binge TV series and every, and all that, and absolutely phenomenal. Anyone watching who hasn't watched It's a Sin, 4OD, I'll see you there. But how do we challenge that? How do we challenge the view in which our stories are sold or agreed to be written about? It's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah, I have a few ideas, but I wouldn't want to get sucked into a separate discussion. But I think the point you've made is really valid. People think that there isn't a demand necessarily for this type of work in the media or in papers, but I just think that's absolutely not true. And that whenever you have the opportunity to have these representations, people really gobble them up. Disclosure I was talking about, many people are hopeful that might get some Oscar nominations. So I am always a bit skeptical when people bring up the kind of the market forces point, as it were. But yeah, I could go on and on about media structures, but that's just my initial thoughts.
Well, thank you both so much. I am so sorry that we're out of time. I can't believe how quickly this webinar has gone, although I really appreciate your insights on such an important topic. And I hope everyone who's attended this evening has something to take away from the conversation we've had, both as food for thought, but also hope for the future, and many resources that you both shared as well, to do some homework and read up and watch some TV, which is never a bad recommendation, is it? If you are an alumnus of the university and you have a topic you want to pitch for our For Alumni by Alumni series, of which this is part of, either a live webinar, written blog in our e-news, please do get in touch. The details of how to do that will be in the follow-up email that we'll send to you. And we hope you'll join Cardiff University for another virtual event. We have a packed online event schedule, and you can access the full list via our website, which is cardiff.ac.uk/alumni/events. As mentioned, you'll receive a follow-up email in the next few days with the links to the recording of today's event and to register for future events. And most of all, thank you so much to Crash and Bleddyn for sharing their expertise so generously, Allwn. And thanks also to our audience for joining us and asking such important questions. Thank you again for attending. Have a lovely evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.